since the U.S. Justice Department announced that it was going to put a federal monitor over Newark and put a consent decree in place, we haven't had any Newark families come to us with Newark police brutality cases. We've had Newark families come to us whose son, daughter, husband was killed in like Lyndhurst or Rutherford, but just the fact that the Justice Department was in here, did an investigation, made this announcement, they have calmed down. And that shows you that when attention is drawn to the problem, people really look like they're going to get serious, that people calm that behavior down. And so it's going to be interesting to see what the years ahead will bring.
And now that we're speaking about police brutality, how did police brutality, housing, and other factors contribute to the rebellion? And the big question is, well, what is the rebellion?
The Newark Rebellion is what WikiLeaks and others would refer to as the Newark riots. Now, there's a whole history of rioting in the United States. The popular mythology would have you believe that it was only black people that rioted. But up until the 1960s, most of the riots that occurred in the United States were white riots. They were riots of white people trying to burn down black communities. One of the ways that Harlem got formed and became a black community, I don't know if you remember that movie, the Gangs of New York. Wasn't that Tarantino? No? Yes?
No.
Okay. But the Gangs of New York, if you saw that movie, you will see the draft riots that occurred in the 19th century during the Civil War. Many Irish and other immigrants came to the U.S. in that period, and many of them were drafted. And they didn't come to the U.S. to fight a war, and they really didn't come to the U.S. to end slavery. You know, they were trying to escape the potato famine and other things that happened to them. And so they would come to the U.S. and get drafted. And so there was, just like during Vietnam, there's a lot of resistance to the draft. There was this resistance. So black folk had all lived down at the other end of Manhattan where the World Trade Center was, that area. Well, they burned that part down. So people migrated up to New York to Harlem. And that's how Harlem became Black Harlem. So up until, let's say, the 1960s, for the most part, although there were some other black uprisings before that, but not many. The riots were white. But in the 1960s, as I said earlier, from 1960 to 1972, there were more than 1,000 what would be called civil disturbances by the authorities, uprisings. These uprisings were a collective response to the racial oppression that existed in the United States. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I grew up in the Central Ward of Newark. It's hard for you to see this now because you're young, and that was a half a century ago. But there was a time when almost all black people lived in the Central Ward of Newark. Black folk couldn't get a house on the other side of Central Avenue. On the other side of Clinton Avenue. It would be hard to imagine that the South Ward of Newark was once a predominantly Jewish community, that Weequahic High School was once a predominantly Jewish school, you know, but that's how things were back in my day. I was born in '53, so I was born in the era of segregation. And it wasn't just Jim Crow in the South, it was Jim Crow in the North. There's something called redlining, where banks will redline an area and won't give loans to people, mortgage loans, so that they can buy a house in that area. Redlining kept communities segregated. So most black folk who came up from the South ended up living in the Central Ward of Newark. And this replicates itself in cities across the country where people are crowded into these ghettos and can't escape because of housing discrimination. So the housing was very bad. You know, it would be hard for me to convince your generation, that there was a time in my lifetime when many apartments were called cold water flats, that you didn't have hot water, that you had to have a big pan and you had to fill the pan with water and put it on the stove and make hot water in your house. Newark had some of the worst housing conditions in the country. So it was the bad housing. It was the poor schools. The schools were segregated. And of course, the schools in the black community were worse than the schools in the white community. Earlier, someone had made reference to all the industry that was in Newark. Yes, there was industry. The popular narrative would have you believe that most of the industry began to migrate out of the urban areas as a result of the riots. That is not true. The migration of industry out of urban areas begins after World War II because property taxes were rising. And so to escape these increasing property taxes, the businesses moved to the suburbs where there was a lower property tax rate. So the major moves had already taken place. Yes, some did leave, some who were still here did leave as a result of the riots, but most of the exodus of the major industries had already happened prior to 1967. A lot of people don't know that, but nonetheless, if we got jobs in these industries, we got the lowest paying, dirtiest jobs. I can remember in my lifetime when there was the First National State Bank downtown, the National Newark and Essex Bank. You couldn't get a job in the bank as a teller. The only job you could get would be as a janitor or a cleaning lady. That's the only job you could get. I can remember when there were segregated movie theaters in Newark, New Jersey. The Paramount, the Lowe's, the RKO Proctors, the Branford, the Adams theaters. These were theaters downtown. Black people couldn't sit on the ground level. It's called the mezzanine. We had to sit in the balcony because it was segregated movie theaters. You could not try. There's a big building between Halsey and Washington in Newark now, a big brown building, right? And there's all these little stores at the bottom. Well, that used to be one great big department store called Bamberger's. And black people could not try on clothes. Like if you went to buy clothes in Bamberger's, a black person couldn't buy clothes there, couldn't try the clothes on. If you went to the hat store on Branford Place, a black man could not try on a hat. If he didn't know his hat size, he couldn't try on a hat because no white person would put a hat on their head that a black person had already had. This was what existed up north in Newark, New Jersey. So indignity upon indignities, and then the worst indignity of all was the police brutality, the police corruption, the police discrimination, how the police were used. See, the police have always been part of an entire system of racial control that has existed in the United States. A system of racial control that was developed during slavery, that was modified and kept in place during the Jim Crow era, and today manifests itself in the prison systems. The prisons are the new plantations of America, and its prisoners are the new slaves. And in fact, if you read the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that was passed in 1865 after the end of the Civil War that abolished slavery, slavery is abolished for everybody except those who commit a crime. This is what's written in the 13th Amendment. And so that's been applied. And that has been a rationale for the near re-enslavement of black people immediately after the Reconstruction period, the period after the end of the Civil War and after slavery and goes on today. So these conditions, poor housing, poor schools, can you believe there were segregated hospitals in Newark? There was actually a Negro hospital, because that's what black people called themselves back in the 50s, Negroes. And that building where the Negro hospital is still standing on West Kenny Street. You'd look at that building today, you say, how could that have been a hospital? But there were segregated hospitals, in Newark and it throughout the country. So all of these conditions made a boiling cauldron, and the incidents of police brutality were the spark on the wick of the dynamite that lit on the fuse that was lighted by the rebellion and caused what was lighted by police brutality and caused the explosion, which was the rebellion. And these were rebellions. A riot is something that happens after a football game or a soccer game that the people can put down with a few policemen. This was a rebellion. Newark had a 1,300-member police force in 1967. The police couldn't put it down. They had to call in 700 state troopers to assist them. The police and the state troopers couldn't put it down. They had to call in the National Guard to put it down. That's a rebellion. That's not a riot. That's a collective act of resistance to oppression. And there were nearly 3,000 people arrested, 1,500 people were injured, 26 people were killed. And during the rebellion, it was said that these people were killed by black snipers. But when they did the autopsies of the people that were killed, all the bullets were bullets that came from the rifles of the National Guard, the state troopers, and the local police. And there was a fellow, his name was Ron Parambo. He wrote a book called No Cause for Indictment, all about how no one was indicted for killing those people during the rebellion of 1967. No one was held accountable for their deaths. At the intersection of 15th Avenue and Springfield Avenue and Irving Turner Boulevard is one of those little triangular parks. And right in the middle of the park is a granite slab. That's a monument to the rebellion of 67. And on that slab are all the names of the 26 people who were killed during the rebellion. The People's Organization for Progress, every July, almost for the entire 32 years of our existence, has had an event to mark the anniversary of the rebellion. And now we go there because that monument wasn't erected until the 1990s, is sometime during the 90s. And now we hold our observance there of the rebellion. But those are the conditions. And I also have to say this, now I know I'm drawing this out forever, but you have to understand that during the 50s and the 60s, there was a worldwide revolution going on. There was a worldwide struggle going on against colonialism. The countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America had been under European domination. You know, most of them were colonies. And liberation movements rose up in these colonies, in Asia and in Cuba. You had Fidel Castro and Che, the Cuban Revolution, in Algeria, and in Angola, and in Mozambique, and in Guinea-Bissau, and in Zimbabwe, and in South Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in Vietnam. These uprisings were against colonialism, but there was a symbiosis, a relationship between the struggle of people in this country for civil rights and human rights and the struggle abroad against colonialism and imperialism. Because at the bottom, the same system created both. And the people who were struggling, I can show you pictures. No one would ever believe this. I can show you a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King and Kwame Nkrumah. Do you know that Dr. King was at the installation of Kwame Nkrumah as the first president of Ghana? I can show you a picture of Martin Luther King and Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, who became the president of Zambia. And in 1966, Kaunda and Dr. King are at the United Nations holding a press conference together, calling on the United States to divest, calling on U.S. businesses to stop doing business with South Africa and with Rhodesia, which was still struggling against colonialism, against white domination. So there was a relationship that a lot of people see. People only talk about the civil rights movement as if it was only here and that's over them. No, there was a worldwide effort going on. And there was an expression we had during the 60s called right around the cornerism, because people believed that